The dense alien jungle was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and the distant echoes of battle. Eric Voss stumbled forward, his breathing ragged, one hand pressing against the deep gash on his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, but he couldn't afford to stop. Above him, the night sky was filled with the menacing hum of eye-controlled drones, their red scanning lights sweeping across the landscape, searching for any signs of life. If they found him, there would be no mercy. His dropship had been shot down hours ago. He was supposed to be on an extraction mission, but things had gone to hell fast. His entire unit was dead. Now, he was the only human left on this godforsaken planet, hunted like an animal. His cloaking device flickered, barely masking his heat signature. The battery was running low. He needed shelter, somewhere safe, if such a place even existed anymore. A rustling sound made him freeze. Instinct took over, and he raised his sidearm, ready to fire. His pulse pounded in his ears as he peered through the thick foliage. Then he saw her, a woman, not human. Her skin was a shade of soft violet, her glowing golden eyes wide with fear. She clutched a small child tightly against her chest, her body trembling. The girl was no older than 4 or 5, her tiny arms wrapped around her mother's neck. The woman's lips moved, whispering something in a language Eric couldn't understand. But the desperation in her eyes told him everything. She was just as hunted as he was. Before he could react, a sharp beeping sound filled the air. Eric's heart sank. The drones had locked onto their position. A red targeting laser painted the ground at his feet. "Move," he barked, lunging forward. The woman gasped but didn't hesitate. Clutching her child, she turned and ran. Eric followed, ignoring the burning pain in his side. Behind them, the night erupted in fire as the drones unleashed their attack. Explosions tore through the jungle, setting the trees ablaze. The heat was unbearable. Smoke choked the air. The woman stumbled, nearly falling. Eric grabbed her arm, yanking her forward. "Keep going." She nodded, pushing herself harder. The cave entrance appeared ahead, a dark, gaping hole in the mountainside. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. They dove inside just as another blast rocked the ground behind them. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Eric pulled the woman deeper into the shadows, pressing a hand over her mouth as she struggled to catch her breath. The child whimpered softly, burying her face against her mother's shoulder. Outside, the drones hovered, their searchlights scanning the entrance. Eric held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled tight. One wrong move, one sound, and they were dead. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the drones let out a mechanical chirp and drifted away, their glowing lights disappearing into the smoke-filled sky. Eric exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon. His whole body ached. The woman turned to him, her eyes filled with something between fear and gratitude. "You? Human." Her voice was accented, hesitant. He nodded. "Yeah." She swallowed, hugging the child tighter. "You helpless. Why?" Eric let out a bitter chuckle. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I'm tired of watching innocent people die." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his injured side. He flinched, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed her palm over the wound, a soft glow emanating from her skin. Eric felt warmth spread through him, the pain easing slightly. He stared at her in disbelief. "How did you?" Before she could answer, the child stirred in her arms. She looked up at Eric with wide, curious eyes. "Mama, is he safe?" the girl whispered. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Scylla. He saved us." Scylla blinked, then did something that completely took Eric off guard. She reached out, tiny fingers touching his face. "Thank you, mister." Eric had faced death more times than he could count. He had fought in wars, survived impossible odds, but nothing had ever made him feel the way that small, innocent gesture did. He cleared his throat, looking away. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated again, as if afraid to trust him. But finally, she whispered, "Luraya." Eric nodded. "All right, Luraya. We need to move before those drones come back." She shook her head. "No, we stay. Aye. Everywhere. No escape." Eric cursed under his breath. She was right. The AI had taken over this planet. There was no running, no safe place left. But he refused to accept that. His gaze shifted to Sela, who was watching him with quiet trust. He had lost everything: his unit, his mission, his home. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something left worth fighting for. He looked back at Luraya. "Then we fight." Her eyes widened in shock. "Fight? Impossible. Too strong." Eric smirked, pulling a small device from his belt. It was his last EMP grenade, his final trick up his sleeve. "Not if you know how to hit them where it hurts." Luraya stared at him, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. For the first time since the war began, she wondered if there was still a chance to survive. The cave was dark, damp, and smelled of earth and old stone. Eric leaned against the rough wall, trying to steady his breathing. His wound still ached, but Luraya's strange healing touch had dulled the worst of the pain. He couldn't afford to let it slow him down. The eye-controlled drones were still out there, scanning the jungle, hunting for anything that moved. They would return soon, and this cave wouldn't keep them hidden forever. Luraya sat across from him, holding her daughter close. Sela had fallen asleep, her small hands clutching at her mother's clothing. The sight of the child stirred something deep in Eric. He had seen too many innocent lives lost in this war. He wouldn't let this little girl become another casualty. Luraya's golden eyes stayed locked on him, wary but curious. She had every reason to be suspicious. Humans and her kind had never been allies. But right now, survival was all that mattered. "You fight them?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but firm. Eric exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "Yeah," he said. "I fight them. It's what I was sent here to do." She tilted her head, her gaze unreadable. "But you are alone." He let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, that happens a lot." Silence settled between them. Outside, the distant hum of the drones grew louder. Luraya tensed, clutching Sela tighter. Eric checked his gear. His rifle was useless. The power cell had been drained. His sidearm only had a few shots left. The EMP grenade was his last real weapon. It wouldn't destroy the drones, but it could disable them long enough for an escape. Luraya shifted closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said, we fight." He met her gaze. "That's right." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. "I cannot fight. I am weak." Eric shook his head. "You survived this long. That means you're stronger than you think." She hesitated, then looked down at her sleeping daughter. When she spoke again, her voice was laced with quiet desperation. "Sela's father, he left us. When the machines came, he ran." Her eyes darkened. "He said we were a burden." Eric felt anger stir in his chest. He had seen men like that before, cowards who abandoned their own to save themselves. He hated them. "I'm not him," Eric said simply. Luraya studied him, as if searching for a lie, but there was none. Finally, she nodded. "Then, what do we do?" Eric glanced toward the cave entrance. The red scanning lights of the drones flickered through the trees, searching for them. "We make them regret coming after us." The moment he said it, the cave exploded with noise. The drones had detected something, and they weren't waiting any longer. A bright red laser shot through the entrance, striking the ground just feet from Eric's boots. He grabbed Luraya's arm and pulled her to her feet. "Run," he shouted. Luraya clutched Sela and sprinted toward the back of the cave. Eric turned, firing 2 quick shots at the drone hovering just outside. The bullets sparked against its metal shell, barely denting it. The machine whirred angrily, its targeting system locking onto him. Eric didn't wait. He yanked the EMP grenade from his belt, pressed the activation switch and threw it. The small device landed directly under the drone, pulsing with blue energy before detonating. The explosion wasn't loud, but the effect was instant. The drone's red eye flickered wildly before it crashed to the ground in a heap of smoking metal. But there was no time to celebrate. More drones were coming. Eric grabbed Laraya's hand and pulled her deeper into the cave. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to squeeze through a tight passage. Rocks scraped against Eric's arms as he pushed forward. The sound of metal slicing through the air echoed behind them. The AI wouldn't stop. They were relentless. Up ahead, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. Eric stumbled inside, breathing hard. Laraya followed, her face pale but determined. Sela whimpered softly, clinging to her mother. "There's got to be another way out," Eric muttered, scanning the cave walls. He spotted a small crack in the far side, too narrow for a drone to follow them through. "Come on." He motioned for Laraya to go first. She hesitated, glancing at the child in her arms. "I will slow you down. You won't if I cover you." She swallowed hard, then nodded. Carefully, she slipped through the opening, squeezing through the tight space. Eric turned, gripping his sidearm, ready for whatever came next. The first drone entered the chamber, its metal legs clanking against the stone. Its glowing red eye locked onto him. Eric took a deep breath. "All right, you piece of scrap. Let's see how good you really are." He fired. The shot hit the drone's sensor, making it shudder. But it wasn't enough to stop it. The machine lunged forward. Eric dodged to the side, barely avoiding the razor-sharp blade that shot out from its arm. He fired again. This time, the bullet struck a weak point near its joint, making it stagger. But it wasn't down. The second drone entered the cave. Eric cursed. He was outnumbered. He backed up toward the narrow opening, his mind racing. If they got past him, they'd reach Laraya and Sela. He couldn't let that happen. The first drone lunged again. Eric ducked, rolling across the ground. He grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at the machine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make it pause. Then he saw it, a small gap in the ceiling, barely noticeable, if he could lure them beneath it. Eric holstered his gun and whistled loudly. "Come on, you rust buckets. You want me. Come and get me." The drones rushed forward. At the last second, Eric jumped to the side. The first drone skidded to a halt, right under the weak spot in the ceiling. Eric didn't hesitate. He slammed his boot against the rock above, and with a loud crack, the ceiling collapsed. A massive chunk of stone fell, crushing the drone instantly. Sparks flew as its metal body was smashed into the ground. The second drone hesitated. Eric didn't give it a chance. He grabbed his last grenade, primed it, and threw it. The explosion sent dust and debris flying. The drone let out a final screech before its body was torn apart by the blast. Silence followed. Eric coughed, brushing rubble from his face. He turned to the narrow opening. "Laraya, you still there?" A small hand reached out. Eric grabbed it, letting her pull him through. On the other side, Laraya's eyes were wide with disbelief. "You killed them." Eric smirked. "Yeah, and we're just getting started." She looked down at Sela, then back at Eric. Something changed in her expression, something like trust. "We fight," she said, nodding. Eric grinned. "Now you're getting it." But deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The jungle was eerily quiet after the battle. The only sounds were the distant chirping of unseen creatures and the rustling of leaves as the wind swept through the trees. Eric walked beside Laraya, keeping his senses sharp, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The night was creeping in, and he knew they couldn't stay exposed for long. The AI forces would return, and next time, they wouldn't just send a few drones. Laraya carried Sela in her arms, her steps careful but determined. The little girl had woken up after they escaped the cave, but she hadn't spoken since. She clung to her mother, her wide golden eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. Eric had seen that look before. He knew what war did to children. It stole their innocence, left them haunted before they even had a chance to understand the world. Larea slowed her pace, glancing at Eric. "Where do we go now?" Eric sighed, adjusting the straps on his vest. "We need to find shelter before it gets too dark. I have a supply cache a few kilometers from here. Weapons, food, medical gear. If we can reach it, we'll have a better chance of surviving." She hesitated, looking around at the dense jungle. "Will they find us?" "They'll keep searching, but they won't track us easily in this terrain. The canopy is thick, and the AI relies on drones for scouting. As long as we stay hidden, we have a chance." Larea nodded, but there was something in her expression, something more than just fear. She was troubled. She looked at Eric like she wanted to say something but was struggling to find the words. After a few more minutes of walking, she finally spoke. "Eric, why are you still here?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She clutched Sela tighter, her voice quieter now. "The humans. They left. The war on this planet was lost months ago. Your people abandoned it. Yet you are still here. Why?" Eric stopped walking. He hadn't expected that question, but he should have. He had been asking himself the same thing for a long time. He exhaled slowly, looking down at the dirt beneath his boots. "I was part of the resistance. A small group of human soldiers stayed behind after the main forces retreated. We weren't willing to give up. We kept fighting." His jaw tightened, but one by one, we were hunted down. Some were killed. Some were captured. Now, I'm the only one left. Larea's eyes softened, but she didn't look surprised. "You lost them." "Yeah." His voice was quieter now. "They were my brothers, my family. And now, it's just me." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, she looked down at Sela, brushing the little girl's hair gently. "I lost my family too," she whispered. "My sisters, my mother, my home." She swallowed hard. "I have nothing left, except her." Eric looked at the child in her arms. She was barely 5 years old, her small frame curled against her mother. It hit him then, just how alone they really were. Larea looked back at him. "That's why I need you, Eric." He blinked. "What?" She took a shaky breath, gripping his arm. "I need you to stay. Not just for now. Not just for this fight. I need you to stay with us." Eric stared at her, stunned. "Larea, you don't even know me." She shook her head. "But I do." Her grip on him tightened. "I see it in your eyes. You fight because you can't walk away. Because even when everything is lost, you refuse to give up. That is why you are still here." Eric swallowed hard. She wasn't wrong. He had every reason to leave, every reason to give up. But he hadn't. Something deep inside him refused to stop fighting. Larea's voice trembled slightly. "Sela needs someone. She needs a protector, a guide, a father." She hesitated, then met his gaze with fierce determination. "And I need a husband." The words hit Eric like a punch to the chest. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Larea, I'm not." "I know it is sudden," she interrupted, her voice desperate now. "I know you don't see yourself as anything more than a soldier. But Eric, I cannot do this alone." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. He had never expected this. A battle. Sure. A desperate fight to the death. Absolutely. But this was something else entirely. Larea looked away as if ashamed. "I would not ask this of you if there were another way. But my people, they do not take in outcasts. They do not take in the weak. If they find me, they will not protect me. They will take Sela and cast me aside. She will survive, but she will not have a mother." Eric's chest tightened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the helplessness. He knew what it was like to be abandoned, to feel like no one in the universe cared whether you lived or died. Loraya turned back to him. If we are together, if I have a husband, they might accept us. They might let us stay. If not, she let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. Eric exhaled, rubbing his face. This wasn't a decision he could make lightly. But looking at Loraya, at Sela, at the fear in their eyes, he knew there was no real choice at all. He took a deep breath and nodded. All right. Loraya's eyes widened. You will stay. I'll protect you, he said firmly. I'll fight for you. But I don't know if I can be what you need me to be. She studied him for a long moment, then gave a small, sad smile. You already are. Eric wasn't sure if that was true. But for now, it didn't matter. He would fight. He would keep them safe. And maybe, just maybe, he would find something worth living for in the process. The night had settled over the jungle, wrapping it in a thick darkness that swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Eric crouched beside Loraya, his rifle resting in his hands as he scanned the area. They had made it to his supply cache, a small underground bunker hidden beneath the roots of a massive tree. It wasn't much, but it had enough weapons, ammunition, and rations to last a few weeks. Sela slept inside the bunker, wrapped in a blanket, her breathing soft and steady. Loraya sat beside her daughter, sharpening a blade with slow, methodical movements. Her face was unreadable, but Eric could see the tension in her shoulders. They both knew what was coming. The AI forces wouldn't stop hunting them. The battle at the cave had only delayed them. If anything, it had made them more determined. The machines didn't understand fear, didn't experience exhaustion. They only knew one thing: eliminate all threats. And Eric had made himself a threat the moment he killed their soldiers. A distant hum vibrated through the ground. Eric's head snapped up. Loraya froze, her grip tightening around her weapon. The sound grew louder, a deep mechanical drone that sent a chill down his spine. They're here, Eric murmured. Loraya's eyes darkened. How many? Eric reached for his scanner, his fingers moving swiftly over the device. The screen flickered, revealing a swarm of red dots closing in fast. His jaw clenched. Too many. Loraya's breathing quickened. We can't run, can we? No, Eric said. They'll track us no matter where we go. We either fight or we die. Loraya looked down at Sela, then back at Eric. Then we fight. Eric nodded. There was no time for hesitation. He moved swiftly, securing explosives around the perimeter, setting up tripwires, and positioning weapons in key locations. Loraya followed his lead, her movements sharp and precise. She was no stranger to battle, but this was different. This wasn't just survival. This was war. The first explosion shattered the silence. A piercing mechanical screech followed as the jungle lit up with fire. Eric grabbed his rifle, pressing his back against a tree as red-eyed drones flew through the smoke. The machines had humanoid forms, their sleek metal bodies reflecting the fire's glow. They carried plasma rifles, their movements unnervingly fluid, like predators stalking their prey. Eric pulled the trigger. His rifle roared, sending a burst of bullets into the nearest machine. The impact sent it crashing into the dirt, sparks flying from its shattered frame. But more came. Always more. Loraya let out a battle cry, leaping from cover with a blade in each hand. She moved like a shadow, slicing through the machines with precision. Their metal limbs clattered to the ground, their red eyes flickering out one by one. Eric kept firing, taking down as many as he could. But the enemy was relentless. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head, striking the trees, setting them ablaze. The jungle became a battlefield of fire and smoke. A machine lunged at Eric, its metal claws slashing toward him. He barely dodged, rolling to the side and driving his knife into its neck. Sparks erupted as it convulsed, then collapsed. A sharp cry rang out. Eric's blood ran cold. He turned. Loraya was on the ground, a machine towering over her, its gun aimed at her head. Eric didn't think. He moved. A single shot rang out. The machine's head snapped back, a hole burned straight through its skull. It fell, crashing beside Lariah, its weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. Eric rushed to her side, grabbing her arm and pulling her up. "You good?" She nodded, breathing heavily. Still alive. But they weren't safe yet. The AI forces kept coming, wave after wave. Eric's ammo was running low, his muscles aching from the endless fight. Lariah's movements were slower now, exhaustion creeping in. And then, a deafening roar. A massive machine emerged from the smoke, its towering frame blocking out the flames behind it. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Eric, its voice a cold, mechanical snarl. "Human, you cannot win." Eric's grip tightened around his rifle. He had fought these before. Command units. Heavily armored, nearly unstoppable. Killing one took more than just bullets. It took strategy. He glanced at Lariah, then at the bunker. Sela was still inside, hidden. Safe for now. But if this thing got through, there would be nothing left to protect. Lariah wiped sweat from her brow. "How do we kill it?" Eric exhaled. "We don't. Not with what we have." Her eyes narrowed. "Then what do we do?" He smirked. "We make it kill itself." Eric reached into his vest, pulling out a small device, a remote detonator. He had planted explosives across the battlefield, but they were meant for the smaller units. This thing, it needed something bigger. He looked at the towering machine. "A scrap heap," he shouted, raising his rifle and firing a few shots at its head. The bullets bounced off harmlessly, but it worked. The machine turned its attention to him. "Target identified," it growled, raising its massive arm cannon. Eric ran. He weaved through the burning jungle, his heart pounding as plasma bolts tore through the trees behind him. The machine followed, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Eric led it straight into the trap. The clearing. The one place he had rigged with every last explosive he had. He skidded to a stop, turning just in time to see the machine stepping into the kill zone. It aimed its weapon, the red glow intensifying. Eric grinned. He pressed the detonator. The explosion was blinding. Fire and debris shot into the air as the ground beneath the machine erupted. The blast was powerful enough to shake the jungle, sending shockwaves through the trees. When the smoke cleared, all that was left was a smoldering crater. Lariah ran to him, her face filled with relief. "Is it over?" Eric looked around. The battlefield was silent now, the last of the AI forces destroyed. He let out a slow breath. For now, they had won. But Eric knew this was just the beginning. The machines wouldn't stop. They never did. Lariah touched his arm. "We should go." He looked at her, then at Sela, who stood in the bunker doorway, watching with wide, tired eyes. Eric nodded. "Yeah, let's go." They disappeared into the jungle, leaving the battlefield behind. But Eric knew this war wasn't over. Not yet. The jungle was eerily silent. The echoes of the explosion still rang in Eric's ears as he stood near the smoldering wreckage of the command unit. The battle was over, but the weight of it still pressed down on his shoulders. The acrid smell of burnt metal filled the air, mixing with the smoke that drifted lazily through the trees. Bodies of broken machines lay scattered, some still sparking, their red eyes dimmed forever. Lariah moved beside him, her breathing heavy, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She held Sela's small hand in hers, keeping her daughter close. The girl's wide eyes reflected the fire's glow, her little fingers clutching the fabric of her mother's torn clothing. She had seen too much for a child. Eric ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling slowly. His arms ached, his body screamed for rest, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. They had survived, but at what cost? They had won this fight, but the AI forces would return. They always did. There was no running from them, no hiding forever. The machines didn't feel exhaustion. They didn't fear death. They only adapted, learned, and hunted. Lariah turned to him, her voice quiet. What now? He didn't have an answer. He looked around at the battlefield, at the destruction, at the loss. The bunker had held, but barely. Supplies were running low. They couldn't stay here much longer. Sela shifted, her voice barely above a whisper. Are we safe now? Eric crouched down in front of her, forcing a tired smile. For now, kiddo. He reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. But we have to keep moving. Larea nodded, her gaze hardened with resolve. We can't keep running forever. Eric sighed. She was right. The jungle had given them cover, but it wouldn't protect them forever. They needed a plan, a real one. He glanced at the wreckage of the command unit. The machines had sent one of their strongest after them. That meant they saw them as more than just an inconvenience. That meant Eric, Larea, and Sela were a threat. A part of him wanted to take that as a victory. The other part knew what it really meant. They were now marked for elimination. We need to get out of the jungle, Eric finally said. Find a real shelter. Somewhere defensible. Larea hesitated, then nodded. There's an old resistance base north of here. It was abandoned years ago, but if it's still intact, then we have a shot. Eric stood, stretching his sore muscles. How far? 2 days' walk. Maybe 3 if we have to avoid patrols. Sela frowned. More bad robots. Eric ruffled her hair gently. Yeah, but we'll handle them. Larea squeezed her daughter's hand. We always do. They packed what little they had, salvaging ammo and weapons from the destroyed machines. Eric searched through the wreckage of the command unit, hoping to find anything useful. His fingers traced over the cold metal, stopping when he spotted a small blinking device buried under twisted debris. A tracker. His stomach dropped. Larea, he called, his voice sharp. She turned instantly, sensing his urgency. He held up the device, his jaw tightening. They know where we are. Her face paled. How long before they come back? Eric crushed the tracker under his boot. Not long. They didn't waste another second. The jungle was a different place now. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, filled with unseen threats. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the undergrowth sent a jolt of adrenaline through Eric's veins. They moved fast but careful, staying low, avoiding open paths. The deeper they went, the thicker the air felt. The weight of what they had lost pressed down on them. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As the night stretched on, exhaustion crept in. Sela's small legs struggled to keep up, her little body sagging with fatigue. Eric carried her when she couldn't walk anymore, feeling the weight of her trust as much as the weight of her body. Larea stayed close, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow, her blades ready. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that they finally stopped. A small clearing. Quiet. Isolated. For now. Eric set Sela down, letting her curl up against her mother's side. Larea held her daughter close, stroking her hair. Eric sat against a tree, staring at the sky, his mind clouded with thoughts. They had survived another day, but how many more could they last? He wasn't afraid to fight. He had spent his whole life fighting. But this was different. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore. Larea looked at him, her voice soft. You saved us. He shook his head. Not yet. She watched him for a long moment. Then, without warning, she reached out, placing her hand over his. A simple gesture. But in that moment, it meant everything. Eric turned his hand, gripping hers. They had lost too much. But they still had each other. And for now, that was enough. The morning was quiet, too quiet. The jungle, which had once been alive with the sounds of insects and distant creatures, felt unnaturally still. Eric sat with his back against a thick tree, his fingers gripping his rifle loosely. He hadn't slept. Not really. His mind was too full, calculating, planning, wondering if the next step they took would lead them to safety or straight into another fight. Larea stirred beside him, her head lifting slightly as she looked over at Sela, who was still curled up against her side. The little girl was exhausted. She had fallen asleep quickly after their escape, but even in sleep, her small hands gripped her mother's clothing tightly, as if she feared letting go would mean losing everything again. Eric exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "We should move soon." Loraya nodded, brushing strands of dark hair from her face. "The old resistance base isn't far now. If it's still intact, it might be the safe haven we need." "Big if." "I know." He looked at her, at the determination in her alien blue eyes. Despite everything, she wasn't giving up. He admired that. He needed that. With careful movements, they packed what little they had. Eric adjusted the straps of his gear, checking his weapons, making sure they were ready for anything. The last fight had trained them, but they couldn't afford to slow down. The machines never stopped hunting. They had crushed the enemy's command unit, but the AI forces would be back. They always were. Sela yawned, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. "Are we going now?" Eric crouched beside her, offering a small smile. "Yeah, kiddo. We've got a long walk ahead." She nodded sleepily, still too tired to protest. Loraya lifted her into her arms, holding her close as they set off. The jungle was dense, but Eric led the way, moving cautiously. Every now and then, he'd stop, listening, watching for any sign of movement. The further they traveled, the more the trees began to thin. The ground beneath them turned from soft earth to cracked stone. After hours of walking, they finally saw it. Just beyond a ridge, half buried in the landscape, stood the remnants of the old resistance base. It was more of a bunker than a fortress, its steel walls worn from time and war. The entrance was hidden behind overgrown vines and debris, but the structure itself still looked solid. Loraya exhaled in relief. "It's still here." "Looks abandoned," Eric muttered, scanning the area. "That's the hope." They approached carefully. Eric moved ahead, weapon raised, checking for any signs of danger. The doors were thick, reinforced, but with some effort, they managed to pry one open just enough to slip inside. The air was stale, filled with dust and memories of battles long past. The interior was dark, but Eric's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing rusted equipment, scattered crates, and old resistance banners hanging from the walls. Loraya stepped in beside him, her eyes scanning the space. "If the power still works, we might be able to reactivate the systems." Eric nodded, already moving toward what looked like a control panel. He wiped away the dust and pressed a few buttons. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of machinery, dim emergency lights flickered to life. Sela gasped. "It works." Loraya smiled, holding her daughter's hand. "We have a home." Eric wasn't so sure. He continued checking the systems, making sure nothing was broadcasting their location. The last thing they needed was to activate some forgotten distress signal that would bring the machine straight to them. Loraya set Sela down on an old bench and joined him. "What do you think?" He sighed. "It's not perfect, but it's better than running." She touched his arm gently. "That's all we need right now." For the first time in what felt like forever, Eric let himself relax, just a little. They spent the next few hours making the space livable. Loraya found an old storage room filled with supplies, some still usable. Eric worked on securing the entrance, making sure no one, or nothing, could get in without them knowing. Sela, despite her exhaustion, helped where she could, her little hands wiping dust from old chairs, her eyes filled with newfound hope. As the night fell, they gathered in the center of the bunker. Loraya sat beside Sela, running fingers through her daughter's hair. Eric sat across from them, leaning back against a metal crate, his rifle still within arm's reach. Sela looked at him, her small voice breaking the silence. "Are we safe now?" Eric met her gaze, considering his words carefully. He wanted to tell her yes, that everything would be okay. but he had lived through too much to make promises like that. Instead, he said, "We're safer than we were yesterday." She seemed satisfied with that, nodding before resting her head against her mother's side. Larea watched Eric for a long moment. "You stayed with us when you didn't have to." He shrugged. "Didn't feel right leaving you behind." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm glad you didn't." The silence stretched between them, comfortable this time. For the first time in a long while, they had a roof over their heads. They had food, weapons, and a chance. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a beginning.